Thank you, Hanis. Good morning, everyone. I have the honor of introducing our next speaker who recently been conferred with Darjah Parlimen Sentia Mahkota Yang Berbahagia Tan Sri Nazir Razak for his special address entitled Towards a National Reset. Born in 1966, Tan Sri Nazir, who will be celebrating his 55th birthday tomorrow, is also the founding partner and chairman of Ikhlas Capital. Happy birthday, Tan Sri. Tan Sri Nazir has extensive banking experience, having served as CIMB Group Holdings Berhad Chairman for 4 years and as CIMB Group CEO for 15 years, where he spearheaded its transformation from a small Malaysian merchant bank to a leading Asian banking group. Tan Sri Nazir was also instrumental in setting up the CIMB Foundation in 2007. Tan Sri Nazir broached the subject about a better Malaysia a few years back in October 2015 at one of the Hasanah's public forums. Since then, Tan Sri continued researching about the subject, including spending a year in Oxford, also gathered thoughts from prominent political leaders, youth leaders, intellectual and business leaders in Malaysia on the same topic. Tan Sri Nazir recently launched his debut book titled What's in a Name? I believe the book and its idea have been brewing in Tan Sri's mind for quite some time, and he finally able to pen it upon his retirement. It's a book of reflections about what he witnessed, the key events that defined him and his life, and also his ideas on the way forward for our nation. I would advise everybody to get a copy of this revealing memoir. With Malaysia moving to achieve its herd immunity and entering into endemic phase, many believe that the sensible next step is to refresh the country. And to quote Tan Sri once mentioned, what we need is a national reset, a holistic overhaul of our democracy, institutions, and social economy, where I couldn't agree more. Let's hear more from the man himself about this topic, and please join me in welcoming Yang Berbahagia Tan Sri Nazir Razak. Over to you, Tan Sri.
Your life.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you, Sharifah, for that introduction, the plug for my book, and also my birthday wish. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Let me start by congratulating the organizers, Yayasan Hasanah, for a well-curated and thought-provoking event. And for me, of course, the thrill of speaking after Tan Sri Jamila and Adiba, who I have great respect for. And also thank you for allowing me this platform to share a big idea, the idea of a national reset and how we should go about it. There is a note of irony that I am speaking on this topic at a Yayasan Hasanah event. I first mooted the idea, as Sharifah reminded, of a national reset at the Khazanah Megatrends Luncheon address of October 2015. In the elapsed time, the country has gone through many ups and downs, especially on the political front. However, the underlying structural deficiencies remain, and so too the need for a new platform to deliberate and recommend systemic reforms towards a better Malaysia. And by a better Malaysia, I mean one that is politically more democratic and stable, economically more dynamic and conditioned to face pressing challenges such as the fourth industrial revolution and climate change, and socially more just and aligned with our original aspirations of becoming a Malaysian nation. The 2020 pandemic has made the case for a reset even more pressing and compelling. Just as people with comorbidities tend to suffer worse from the virus, Malaysia entered the crisis with pre-existing conditions: endemic corruption, political instability, slow economic growth, high talent outflow, and persistent intercommunal tensions. It is no surprise that that on average, Malaysians suffered more from COVID-19 in both healthcare and economic terms than did their counterparts in most nations. As we know, Malaysia underwent a national reset in response to the crisis of May 13, 1969. Yet the fact is, the COVID-19 crisis of 2020-2021 has resulted in even more damage to lives and livelihoods than the crisis of May 69 did. Were our failings this time the result of bad leadership or a bad system? One barometer for me is the number of good people I know that have gone into politics with the best of intentions, who quickly find themselves having to compromise on their own principles, or not being able to achieve much, or more often, both. We have also seen that since the 1990s, many administrations have tried but failed to reform the system, and that since 4 years ago, we have had 4 different prime ministers despite voting only once. It is difficult not to conclude that our system is no longer fit for purpose. A new leader, a new government, even GE15 are unlikely to solve our systemic dysfunction. Ladies and gentlemen, why the dysfunction? Our prevailing system remains essentially the one designed in the early 1970s following deliberations by the National Consultative Council, a 67-person deliberative platform. They came up with reforms such as Rukun Negara, amendments to the Sedition Act, and affirmative action as innovative ways to respond to the needs of the nation at that time. But these reforms were not designed to last indefinitely, and in the case of the new economic policy, a 20-year term limit was set. This national reset took place over 50 years ago, and even though so much has changed for Malaysia and Malaysians, the system remains substantially in place. In its early years, the new system was largely successful, bringing much needed political stability, accelerating economic growth, reducing poverty, and rebalancing wealth between communities. But the system also had negative side effects, namely heightened corruption, the hardening of identity politics, and concentration of power, which grew in prominence as the system was prolonged. These negative side effects feed on each other and are at the heart of Malaysia's systemic dysfunctions today. Furthermore, the system grew resistant to reforms. The Abdullah Badawi, Najib, and second Mahathir administrations all began with promises of substantial reforms, but failed to achieve material change. In many instances, piecemeal reform proposals were quickly given racial or religious overtones by vested interests and effectively resisted. It has been widely observed that the evolution of democracy is particularly challenging in plural societies in which identity, more than anything else, determines political allegiances. And for Malaysia, identity, of course, is especially potent as it is very much linked to race and religion. For these societies, progressive reforms are often hampered by debates over which community benefits and which one loses. In recent years, even in developed countries, we are witnessing increasing frustration with representative democracy for failing to address major structural issues, mainly because parliamentarians tend to prioritize the short-term interests of political parties and their own re-election. There has concomitantly been a global trend of democratic innovation, most notably of establishing deliberative platforms to deal with complex long-term structural issues unsuited for parliaments. In a recent survey, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development found 289 such platforms across the world, the Irish Citizens' Assembly being the most popular case study. These work in tandem with established institutions and existing democratic processes. As a sign of the times, leading universities, most notably Yale and Stanford, have set up centers for studying deliberative democracy. Deliberative platforms are typically dominated by intellectuals and randomly selected citizens, and thus are generally devoid of political grandstanding and focus on the nation's long-term best interests. Research has shown that these settings enhance consensus building. People with opposing views are more inclined to look for common ground, and those with conflicting interests look for compromise solutions. In the Malaysian context, we are more likely to find solutions to contentious issues such as the future of affirmative action and vernacular schools when these issues are discussed outside the arena of partisan politics and are considered together rather than isolation. Indeed, this approach enabled us to successfully rebuild this nation after the May 1969 crisis. Malaysia was a trailblazer in deliberative platforms. We can revisit the lessons from our own past in order to find a path to a better future. It is certainly encouraging that our politicians across the aisle have recently agreed to a MOU, or the Memorandum of Understanding on Political Stability and Transformation, to bring near-term political certainty and democratic reforms. Nevertheless, the scale of our systemic problems requires far more wide-reaching reforms that are unlikely to come from our existing political processes. Indeed, the reforms listed in the MOU will not address the major root cause of our systemic problems. For instance, endemic corruption is derived from political funding and the nexus between business, politicians, political parties, and an economically active state. In order to stem corruption, we would need a reconfiguration of all those parts of the system, their linkages, and develop truly independent institutional oversight. I have proposed the formation of a new deliberative platform called the Better Malaysia Assembly, or BMA, as a first step to a comprehensive national reset. The proposed assembly will comprise representatives of various social segments and stakeholders, as well as non-partisan thought leaders. And the role of the BMA would be to focus on, firstly, a reaffirmation of the principles of Malaysian nationhood and our implicit social contracts, not just between ethnic groups, but also between the government and the governed, covering many of the important issues discussed at this Hasanah Forum. It would certainly be a way to attend to the tax matter that Tan Sri Jamila interestingly brought up this morning. Following from that, deliberations and the recommendations of how our democracy, institutions, and economy should function, including but not limited to issues of electoral system, political funding, federal-state relations, role of institutions, affirmative action, social safety net, and education. And finally, the BMA should identify the specific policy and legislative changes required to put Malaysia on the path of a national reset. The recommended reforms will be arrived at after closed-door deliberations and through consensus by Assembly members. The Assembly will also seek to leverage on technology to engage the public in unprecedented ways in order to enhance the quality of its deliberations and sense of national inclusivity. The recommendations of the Assembly will be submitted to Parliament for consideration and debate and a parliamentary vote. Parliament could, of course, even choose to put the recommendations to a national referendum, as indeed did the Irish Parliament recently. This process will not undermine, but rather it will enhance our democracy. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe the case for setting up the Better Malaysia Assembly is compelling, and the COVID crisis has only underlined its urgency. Malaysia is not a failed state, but we are a nation in comparative decline, and physics tells us that one accelerates on the downslope. On the flip side, technological and industrial transformations are creating conditions in which countries either leapfrog more advanced ones or fall by the wayside. It is a window of opportunity. It may or may not last long. Success belongs to nations which seize the initiative, first and foremost by ensuring domestic socio-political strength and economic dynamism. In my humble opinion, Malaysia cannot hope for success without a national reset. Such is my conviction on this issue that the topic of a national reset, somewhat unusually, is a big part of my memoirs entitled What's in a Name. And a few weeks ago, on behalf of a diverse group of 55 Malaysians well known in their respective fields, 7 of whom are coincidentally speakers at this Hasanah Forum, I wrote to His Majesty Yang di-Pertuan Agong to seek the support of the Conference of Rulers for the idea of a Better Malaysia Assembly. I am also trying to engage our other institutions on this idea. Ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, I think we can all agree that we and our future generations deserve a better Malaysia, even if we don't agree on how to achieve this goal. My proposal for a Better Malaysia Assembly is my contribution to the discourse, and I thank you very much for your attention. Unfortunately, there is no room here for questions, but I am more than happy to answer any that you might have and consider any comments or feedback after this conference. I can be reached at my website, nazirrazak.my. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.